There is what I thought to be a coincidence. There is an event known as the Thera eruption, which occurred on what is now the Santorini Islands. It's also known as the Santorini eruption. This event occurred approximately at the same time that Ahmose I, the pharaoh from Thebes, decided to come out and chase the Hyksos out of Avaris and Goshen. It just so happens that this eruption is the largest eruption ever recorded. It was barely 600 miles away from Avaris and Goshen. However, it was so big, it had an effect all the way to China, some 5,000 miles away. If it affected China 5,000 miles away, it certainly had a serious effect in that area of Egypt. So therefore, in my book I describe the timing, and I describe that the volcano eruption and the ash and the disaster that it caused was in fact the plagues as discussed in the Bible. So this gave an opportunity to Ahmose I to chase out the Hyksos out of Avaris Goshen. All of this timing, for which there is only one Exodus event, points exactly to the Thera eruption, Ahmose I chasing the Hyksos out, and since Avaris and Goshen were the same location, it had existed only once and was destroyed only once. There's no such thing in history as Goshen having been rebuilt. Therefore, this is the event that circles around on all of this. In my book, I've detailed the dates of this, since we know roughly the dates of the Thera eruption, and we have a good idea of when Ahmose I chased the Hyksos out. So the timing then is much more clear. Some weeks and months after the Thera eruption, the Hebrews and all the other Semitic tribes who were in the Goshen area became weak and ill. Some of them contracted different types of illnesses including leprosy. They became weak, so even the powerful Hyksos army, as they had been known to be, became weak. And as I've mentioned before, this gave Ahmose I the opportunity to chase them out. So as you can see on this map, the red arrow is the direction of Ahmose heading up to Avaris Goshen to chase the Hyksos out of Egypt. Moses is represented by the white arrow, who would head in the direction of Mount Sinai in Arabia. Meanwhile, the Hyksos army, represented in blue or cyan, heads straight for Gaza, where the Egyptian army chases them, encircles them in Sharuhan, and they disappear from history, literally. I'm not saying that the Exodus didn't happen. I'm just saying that it happened differently. I'm not saying they weren't saved from slavery. I'm saying they were saved from imminent slavery. Had they been captured by Ahmose I, certainly that's what would have happened. And maybe worse, since most of them were ill. It's no surprise that we have all these laws in Leviticus about hygiene and good health care, as they had no basic understanding of hygiene. Because of the volcano and the catastrophe that followed, the food was scarce, the animals were sick, they ate sick animals, and they got sicker and sicker as time went on. It is clear to me that the events as recorded are extremely different from what it is that I've found here. And the reason that we can make this conclusion is because of the mysterious triangles that identifies Goshen and Avaris as the same location, that the Thera eruption and Ahmose I are almost at the same time, and that there was only one Exodus event. This is how we know this to be the facts. The Hyksos were rulers. They were chased out. Before they left, they plundered Egypt and left with the loot, which is why not only was the army pursued to Gaza, but the civilians were eventually pursued as well, until the Egyptian army drowned. I'm not saying they didn't drown. I'm saying that those events also happened differently. There existed in the 3rd century BC a Greek historian by the name of Manetho. He was hired by the Greek authorities to write the Egyptian history, discover it and write it. The work he did was covered somewhat by the other famous historian by the name of Josephus, where the Hyksos are referred to within Josephus's work, and details their expulsion and their establishment of the new kingdom in Egypt, the 18th dynasty and so on. The second intermediate period of Egypt was of particular interest to Josephus, where he equated the Hyksos, also known as the Shepherd Kings, as the ancient Israelites who eventually made their way out of Egypt. He even includes a brief etymological discussion of the term Hyksos. So there is a lot of reference to even my own suggestions that the Hyksos are partially or all of the Hebrews, because they were not Israelites until Israel was formed. What Manetho had written was that there was a high priest of the temple of Isis by the name of Osarseph, who, by the way, Manetho himself was a high priest of the temple of Isis. Anyway, this Osarseph led some very sick Hebrews, thousands of them, numbering between 80 to 100,000, out of Avaris and in towards the Sinai Peninsula, and once he reached the Sinai Peninsula, Osarseph changed his name to Moses. The Bible itself has left us some clues about what I've already mentioned. Since Amos 1 was chasing the Hyksos out of Avaris Goshen, obviously that was a war, and the civilians ran southeasterly towards Mount Sinai. So essentially they were avoiding war while they carried the loot that they had plundered from Egypt. So in Exodus 13, verses 17 to 18, "And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, Lest peradventure the people repent when they see war, and they return to Egypt. But God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land of Egypt." King James Version. What war? No reference to the war is mentioned in the biblical text. What war would it be referring to? The only war at that time that matches the Thera eruption and matches everything else is the war of Amos 1, routing the Hyksos out of Egypt. Should they have seen the war, they might have been afraid and returned back to Egypt, welcoming slavery. Here's something else to consider. Now that we know that Jabal al-Laz in Saudi Arabia, currently Saudi Arabia, is the Mount Sinai, and we know where Madian is, the importance of Madian is Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, lived there. That's where he went. That is where he returned with the Hebrews. So on his way to Mount Sinai, he was on his way to his father-in-law's domain. Important to note is that Madian, Jethro's hometown, is only 22 miles from Mount Sinai. Critical to remember is that, according to the biblical text, Moses spent 40 years there before Aaron, his brother, came out of Egypt to get him to come back and help the Hebrews leave Egypt and to bring them back in this area, somewhere between Madian and Mount Sinai. In this presentation, I'll be reviewing the possible paths the Hebrews would have taken when they escaped out of Egypt. I'd like you to notice on the left side in the green marker is Mount Musa, the mountain currently believed to be Mount Sinai, incorrectly of course. One of the observations we can make is that since we know where Goshen is, we can see that if they wanted to go to this Mount Musa, they would have had no water crossing requirement. As well, we cannot deny that Moses traveled from Egypt to the area of Madian, where his father-in-law lived, long before he led the Hebrews out to Mount Sinai. Additionally, while he was in Mount Sinai, his brother Aaron came to meet him. So we need to think about that for a minute, because we have to acknowledge that they knew how to get to where they were going. Also, the biblical text itself says that Aaron met him halfway. You cannot meet somebody halfway without knowing the path that they will take. It's a safe path. It's a path they always use. This is something we need to remember. It was not possible before to really evaluate the path the Hebrews took from Goshen to Mount Sinai. Reason being is no one can be sure or could be sure exactly where Mount Sinai was. Now, we have known since 1946 where Goshen is, and since we know where that is, it should be clear to everybody that Mount Musa certainly cannot be the mountain. But outside of finding a true alternative, I suppose they would continue with this location. So now we have the start, we have the finish, and all we have to do is to consider what obstacles might there be on each particular path. Let us have a look. Have a look at the possible paths, real quick. The white line pointing to the south of Egypt doesn't make much sense if you then look to the right and see where Mount Sinai is. Now that we know where Mount Sinai is, it certainly does not make any sense to go into Egyptian territory where the forces of Ahmose I are coming up from. The red line would be the best possible path because there'd be no water to cross. Now, why would they not use that path? That path is within Amalekite territory. They would be raided and robbed and butchered, so they could not use that path. The purple line has them going up and across the Gulf of Aqaba, and the narrowest path across the Gulf of Aqaba is about 10 miles wide. However, that is still within Amalekite territory. Therefore, that is neither a good path. Now, the yellow path has no enemies whatsoever. They could follow along the coast all the way around until they get to the Strait of Titan. Here is a better view, a different perspective, where we have at the left Avaris Goshen, and we have the destination of Mount Sinai, and you can still see the layout of the triangles. Now, if you look closely, you can see down in the center, in the middle, practically a natural land bridge that connects the Sinai Peninsula with the northwest tip of Arabia. And you can see the town of Madian, which is Jethro's hometown, the area where Moses spent 40 years of his life. Now have a look at a little bit of a closer view where we can see the Strait of Titan, we can see the natural land bridge much better, and we can still see Madian. And as you know already, that is approximately 22 miles away from the real Mount Sinai. Now an even closer look at the natural land bridge, also known as Thompson and Gordon Reef. This is basically a delicate coral reef system. Now this reef system has been in existence for many, many thousands of years. It was okay for men and women and children and some animals to walk across slowly. And just for your information, the largest crossing is barely 3/4 of a mile wide. And so that's the length of the water crossing, about 3/4 of a mile wide. And with this crossing, the water at the time of the existence of the reef, the water depth was approximately 1 foot deep or less. Now, compare that with the very heavy chariots used by the Egyptians as they chased the Hebrews. Those chariots are very heavy, as I detail in my book. I have some weight information. Basically all that's construction with no shock absorbers on these wheels, led by horses with 3 men inside the bucket. The length of the first crossing is approximately 4,000 feet. 4,000 feet long. And on that 4,000 foot section, you could fit 2 columns of 300 chariots. Approximately 600 could fit there. But their weight and their movement across it, bouncing up and down like a jackhammer, ended up destroying the reef system. And so they would have drowned, falling on either side into the Gulf of Aqaba and into the Red Sea. This is my hypothesis. Most Christians are not aware that the scientific community, the archaeologists and historians, have not been able to agree on which mountain is the true Mount Sinai. Without any evidence or anything to support anybody's conclusions, we were not able to ascertain which mountain really was Mount Sinai. Now, my discovery of the mysterious triangles helps to confirm the one contention that Jabal al-Lawz is the real Mount Sinai. In the next few slides, I'm showing you the majority of these mountains. They're represented by these blue icons, triangular blue icons. Here at the highest level, you can see the furthest candidate mountains to be considered as Mount Sinai. As I continue this presentation, I hope you can conclude with me that Jabal al-Lawz is the only and is the true Mount Sinai. Now if we zoom in a little, we can see just the ones closest to the area, and we have three mountains that are outside the triangle systems. One of the three mountains outside the triangle systems is Mount Musa, the mountain currently believed to be the Mount Sinai, the real Mount Sinai, where the tourists flock every year to go and see where Moses received the Ten Commandments, which is of course absolutely false. Now this is the last of these mountains. These are the ones inside the triangle system. There are 6 of them, and essentially the Har Karkum is the one at the top left. This is the one I believe that the prophet Elijah went to when he went to seek God, because up to his point in time, they had already lost track of where the real Mount Sinai was. And because of certain things that are listed in the scriptures, I believe that Har Karkum is where he went. And we can see the other mountains down below. Some of the most modern researchers were convinced that Mount Bagur, Jabal al-Nur, was the Mount Sinai. And of course, they don't complete the triangle system like Jabal al-Lawz does, the one I've identified as the real Mount Sinai. So this is the reason why I am convinced of Jabal al-Lawz. Here then, I hope you can arrive at the same conclusion that I have, that Jabal al-Lawz at Mount Sinai truly is the correct Mount Sinai. We can see that it forms these perfect triangles. We can see it's close to Madian. We can see it's close to the Strait of Titan crossing, and it fits within everything else. Here's the view from the perspective of Egypt at the time of Abraham, where Mount Sinai then is the very top of the triangle system, and Avaris Goshen is now to the bottom right, and the Oddland Formation is to the bottom left, and Temple Mount in Jerusalem is to the bottom center. At the top of Jabal al-Lawz, about 1.5 miles away from the holy ground, where I have the marker for Mount Sinai, that yellow marker, there is a flagstone field. The flagstone are flat rock, perfectly suited for tablets. Out of all the contenders for Mount Sinai, Jabal al-Lawz is the only mountain with this field a short distance away, which also has several caves, which I've identified in my book. It adds another reason as to the certainty of Jabal al-Lawz being the true Mount Sinai. In my book, I propose a location for a Hebrew campsite location on the west side of Jabal al-Lawz. I point it out here where I have it marked. It's the largest flat surface area that can accommodate several 100,000 people if there were that many. We can see Madian 22 miles from Mount Sinai, and we can see the flagstone field to the left. At the top end, we can see the Gulf of Aqaba. An additional hypothesis presented in my book is the location of Kadesh. The importance of Kadesh is that it's the location the Hebrews went to, led by Moses, after they spent nearly a year at Mount Sinai, and this location is where they waited for quite a long time before they could continue moving north. I explain further about all these details. But for this slide, Kadesh, my hypothesis states, is Petra in Jordan. Where you can see on this map, in the center of the map, is Petra, Jordan. To the left, you'll see a marker for the tomb of the prophet Aaron. Not far from there, but I haven't been able to pinpoint exactly where, is the tomb of the prophetess Miriam, Moses' sister. And here you can also see Sela, the capital of Edom, within that region. So they are allowed to live within the rock structure that Petra is known for. And the community, the large capital of Edom, was sitting just east of them. Any supplies, anything they may have needed to survive for 2.5 centuries was there. My hypothesis here is that Petra Jordan is the biblical Kadesh Barnea, which is roughly an 11 days walk north, straight up from Mount Sinai, and you can see the line. It is practically straight up to the Temple Mount at Jerusalem. The distance from Mount Sinai at Jabal al-Lawz to Kadesh Barnea is 113 miles, and it's exactly 100 miles further up to the Temple Mount. Here then is my proposed complete route from Egypt to Israel, the road to Israel, if you will, as they would cross the Strait of Titan, the natural land bridge that collapsed after the chariots of the Egyptian army destroyed the reef, essentially forever destroying this route. There's literally no way back for any of them. They proceed up to Madian, they proceed up to Mount Sinai, they camp there for a year. They move 11 days walk north to Kadesh, where they spend 2.5 centuries waiting for things to change in the Canaan area where they want to collect their land, the promised land. The reason why they're not able to move from there, and the reason the spies came back and told them that it was too dangerous for them to proceed, they had to wait, is because Egypt had not only routed the Hyksos out of Egypt, chased them into Gaza, but they continued to reconquer the Canaan lands all the way up to Syria, near Turkey, and they stayed there for well over 200 years, which explains why they were stuck at Kadesh for all that time. Jews and Christians traditionally believe that justice is a present, real, right, and specifically governing concept along with mercy, and that justice is ultimately derived from and held by God. According to the Bible, such institutions as the Mosaic Law were created by God to require the Israelites to live by and apply His standards of justice. Abraham's grandchildren, Esau and Jacob, were twins. The firstborn obtains the birthright, and this had fallen onto Esau. Esau had the birthrights of the firstborn because out of the twins he was the first one to be born. Those of you who are familiar with the story, it's one thing, but those of you who are not, I advise you to first go to Genesis 25, verses 29 to 34, and those verses you will read of the extortion. In Genesis 27, you will read of the swindle, and verse 27:19 specifically, you see Jacob clearly lying, pretending to be his own brother in order to receive the blessing. I touch on this in my book in a chapter I call The Great Swindle. Most Christians will have heard of Edom and will have heard that Edom is hated, the enemy of Israel, and it is therefore to be vilified, which it has been since the beginning of the written Torah. So one of the reasons that is because Esau is one of the patriarchs of Edom. As well, the other patriarch who comes from the same family as well is Abraham's firstborn, Ishmael, who married someone by the name of Basemath, and as a group they are patriarchs of Edom. There might be some others that are patriarchs, but those are the principal ones. And it would seem that the vilification of Edom, however prevalent it is in the Bible, is based, I believe, on protecting the great swindle, to keep it justified into the minds of those who will read the story and wonder, how is it possible that God will allow someone to rip somebody off so well the way that this was done with Jacob from his father? And let me remind you that blessing I repeated a while ago. When Isaac was giving that blessing to Jacob, he thought he was giving that blessing to Edom. So as it were, in the mind of Isaac, the blessings he gave to Esau and not to Jacob.